Pray together. And Lord, again, we do thank you for your goodness, and Lord, we are grateful for all that we've been a part of so far, and as we look into your word, Lord, I pray that you would take us through each moment of it, and may we each, as individuals, see where you are leading us to how we may apply what we do see and what we read and hear. So we give this time to you. In your name, amen. You know, it's February 16th, and we're halfway through February now, and when we kind of hit this time of the year, I kind of start looking ahead. I start looking ahead to the next season, that being spring. Yeah, and our winter's been fairly good all in all. Like all in all, it's been fairly decent. It's, you know, yeah, we've had some snowfalls here, which were pretty decent, and there were some cold days that we had this past week, and a few here and there, but really it's been kind of a tame winter in comparison to previous winters, especially last winter. Last winter I thought was really cold this time of the year, but I guess what's going on with me is that, like, the truth is as I'm getting a little older, I'm liking the snowless months and the warmer months a little bit more than I am liking the colder months now. And but yet I loved being in the outdoors. It's not that I don't like being in the outdoors, but I certainly spent a lot of time in the outdoors, whether we were skating on the pond or tobogganing or sledding, skiing, and even some hunting. And I still like the outdoors, although, you know, growing up here, I didn't really get into the hunting here when I was like growing up here, hunting or fishing. But I sure did have a lot of fun with that in the north. So I was more introduced to it there, and my start with that kind of outdoor fun, yeah, it really was in northeastern BC. But before getting too far along into it, I had to take a couple of courses so that I could go out with our friends on these hunting expeditions. And there was this one course I had to take called CORE, Conservation Outdoor Recreation Education. Now, I didn't actually take the course. I got the book, and I took the test, and I actually managed to pass the test. And so then after that, got that out of the way, the next thing was to take my FAC, my Firearms Acquisition course. Now it's called PAL, Possession Acquisition License. And so I had to get that so that I could carry around and purchase my own firearm. And that FAC course was really memorable, really memorable. A good friend of ours by the name of Dustin Rust, Dustin was, well, we call him Dusty, he was an RCMP officer, and at that time, going back, I guess, I don't know, 1990 something, he had just received his certification to teach this FAC course. And but before he booked himself up with teaching too many of these classes, he wanted to do a trial run, and so he gathered together some of us, and I was able to get in on that. It was about a dozen of us, I suppose. I don't remember the exact number. And so we were able to take this class for a nominal fee, and then Dusty would get his kind of work out his presentation, and we could get our FAC out of this whole thing. And also among Dusty's students had been his very own father-in-law, whose name was Ezra King, and Ezra brought with him his older brother, Andy. I think Andy was the older one. And Ezra and Andy King, probably in their late 50s or mid-50s to late 50s at that time, and a real couple of redneck hillbillies, if there ever were any. And they were loggers and farmers, and they were a whole lot of fun. And when they came into that class, they added so much to that class in way of stories and opinions and input that wasn't necessarily appreciated by Dusty all the time, but it was really funny. And Dusty was doing his very best to teach this class, and who was giving him a hard time was his very own family. And from time to time, Dusty would have to say, okay, let's get a little serious here. He's being very gracious, and well, it's his father-in-law, for goodness sake, and he says, yes, you know, we're friends here, and yeah, I'm learning to teach this here too, but this is still a course that you all have to have. And it would quieten up for a few minutes, but slowly in time, Andy and Ezra kind of pick it up again, and the side commentary would start all over again. And finally, at one point, Dusty became so frustrated, and he just rattled off a few firearm safety remarks, and all of them basically were directed solely at the King brothers. And I cannot remember all of what Dusty said, but it was just a string of things. And it was, you know, along this line, there's a couple lines I remember, but Anyway, I'll pick out a few of them. And he's kind of rattles off, upset. He says, when you see an animal, no, you don't fire at it from your vehicle. And no, you don't fire at it while standing even on the road. And if you see an animal that is somewhat concealed by brush, you don't shoot at it. Clean shots only. And Dusty was getting really hot, and even the brothers kind of, okay, maybe we've maybe pushed him too far. And they sat quietly as Dusty just carried on. And the final thing that Dusty did was he walked over to the whiteboard that he had there, and he had a diagram. I drew that, but that was what he drew. And I know, that's a man on the bottom there with a rifle shooting upward. And Dusty goes over, he draws this really fast, so I don't know if his artistry was any better than mine. But then he says, and again, directly at Andy and Ezra, and he says, okay, there's a target at the top of the hill. Is that a safe shot? And Andy, no. He says, do you take that shot? Andy again, yes. And Ezra, probably. And oh gosh. And it was quite the thing. And Andy and Ezra, really, they were only having some fun. But you can certainly appreciate how frustrated Dusty was, because he's trying to hone his teaching skills here and iron out his presentation. And I also know this too, that Andy and Ezra, they could handle a firearm probably better than anybody that was in that room at that time. And maybe even better than Dusty himself. But I also know this, that probably as experienced as they were in the bush, I also know that the rules and the laws would have been hard choices for them to adhere to during some of their hunting expeditions. And listen, some of the regulations, they do make hunting quite a challenge, and the temptation to look past some of those things and stipulations and regulations and so forth, it's a very real temptation. And I know those two guys would have felt that. And in thinking of that, how is that any different to other areas of life too? And what do I mean by that? I'm going to try to get into that. I think that sometimes there's an obvious choice that can be put in front of us, a very obvious choice. It's clear what we're to do, but making the obvious choices can be easier said than done at times, can't it? And I think that our Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy alludes to that a little bit. And let me paraphrase a little bit here, where it says, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. So if you obey, if you listen, walk in a way that is godly, you're going to be all right, and you will avoid a whole lot of unnecessary grief. And specifically, the choice that God is asking for his audience to make is to stop chasing after lifeless things, whether it's idolatry or whatever, and be good to each other, respect each other, love each other, and everything will be all right. And this sounds well enough, doesn't it? And it sounds like the right and obvious choice to make, but again, making the obvious choices isn't always the easiest thing to do. And in fact, it's downright hard. And I think that Jesus made that quite clear too in his conversation to the Pharisees from our gospel reading in Matthew chapter 5, where he's speaking with a group of Pharisees, and he broadens the parameters of some things. He broadens really the parameters of sin in relation to one's choices and lifestyle, where he said, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser. Now, of course, there's a real point that Jesus is making here. And he doesn't come right out and say it, but the point is there nonetheless. And if his listeners hadn't arrived at full comprehension of what that point was just yet, and if they were still digesting all of what Jesus just said, what murder all was, he then had something to say about adultery. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. Well, listen a little further. Whoever even looks lustfully on a woman has already committed adultery in their heart. So how do we understand that one? I have an old friend that I got to know, just somewhat, more acquainted than anything. His name is Blaine Greiner. And Blaine is a long-time youth pastor, and he's about 12 to 15 years older than I am, and he's still in youth ministry, and I think that is quite something. That's pretty awesome. And I remember Blaine had shared a story when he was driving in Seattle. That's where he resides, in this Seattle area. And he's on his motorbike, his motorcycle, and he noticed this very pretty lady walking on the sidewalk. And he glanced over and he notices her, and then he said to his audience, of whom he was sharing this story with, he says, now that first glance wasn't sin. And then, after that first glance, Blaine turns his attention back to the road that he's driving on, but there was something in him, and he just had to turn and have another look. And he peers at this lady again, and then he ran smack right into a vehicle that was right in front of him. And then he said, now it was that second glance. Now that was sin. So what do you think? Is Blaine right? And if the Pharisees were having any trouble keeping up with the conversation that was going on, Jesus has even more. He goes, oh, and divorce. Anyone who divorces his wife on any other ground other than sexual immorality will make her commit adultery, and whoever who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Maybe it sounds straightforward enough, but I think that the Pharisees would have comprehended this one fairly quickly. I don't think there would have been a whole lot of reading between the lines for them. I think that they had heard enough previously from Jesus to recognize where he was going, what was being implied. You see, women in the first century, and really still in various parts of the world today, are abused, mistreated, and in the first century culture, when a lady no longer met the standard, whatever that standard was, whether it meant being beyond childbearing years or someone had just lost interest in her, a husband had the latitude and the right to just simply discard her, put her outside of the household. And what a horrible plight that would be for a lady to find herself in. No means of support for herself. And in some instances, when in that position, without any support of family or so forth, she was as good as dead. So by being forceful in his stance on divorce, it's really a protective directive that has the lady's best interest in mind. And Jesus is communicating that all people, male and female, are all the same. You're all equal and ought to be treated equally and fairly in all matters, and that physical dominance or power is ridiculous. Male chauvinism is ridiculous. Treat people as you would have them treat you, regardless of who they are. And then for good measure, Jesus has something to say about taking oaths. Reading sort of paraphrase here. You have also heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows. You must carry out the vows you make to the Lord. But I say to you, do not make any vows. Don't go off, spouting off in all kinds of impressive language when making your promises, because it just makes you look silly when you have no intention of keeping them anyway. Just speak the truth. Be truthful. Tell the truth. And of course, the implication that Jesus' audience, to the Pharisees, is they were dishonest. And they broke oaths and they didn't tell the truth, and really they are no more righteous than the next person, and they were the same as everyone else, in that they were sinners in desperate need of the grace of God. And so then what is the overall point that Jesus is making? And did the Pharisees get it? I think they got it. Perhaps, though, maybe, how it can be, human nature. Maybe some were perhaps a little stubborn to admit it, or maybe a little too dogmatic, too narrow-minded, or too elitist, too arrogant, perhaps. But the point, did they get it? I think some would have gotten it. But I think maybe even more importantly, though, is do we get it? The underlying premise, it seems clear to me, be reconciled with God. Be reconciled to God. Be right with God. And really, I think our Deuteronomy reading and Jesus' words from Matthew chapter 5, they say something very similar here. They say what I think is the same thing. In Deuteronomy, choose life or death. Follow God's precepts, his commands, his statutes, his laws, and his ways, and you're going to be okay. Now, the choice itself, it doesn't just concern mere existence, because it says, you will have life, you follow God's ways, and it's not just mere existence that's the concern here, as much as it is just the heart of men and women, the condition of the heart for men and women, for people. God is more concerned for a faithful lifestyle, and that's what choosing life is all about. It's with our whole being. It's this holistic commitment, if you will, in being reconciled with God. So to be in right relationship with God. And what does that entail or look like? And how do we understand that one? And I think that Jesus spells that out too for us. To be in a right relationship with God, to choose life, and when in a right relationship with God, it does something. I think it greatly increases the capacity to be in right relationship then with one another. And it increases the capacity for reconciliation. And I think that courage is found to do the hard things in being the peacemakers that we're all called to be. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Tell the truth. Treat people right. Treat your spouse right. This all has something in common, and be right with one another. And Jesus is, like, in calling his listeners, he's not telling them to avoid these things, like the righteousness or moral living, but rather dig deeper into those statements. Dig deeper into them. Because he teaches that it is insufficient to simply avoid murdering someone. And how? By exposing the anger and rage, the bitterness or resentment that lies within at times, which is the fuel for the acts of those kinds of things like murder or violence or adultery and the like. The act is a result of the root that's in the heart. And so in the end, the commands of God, they're not this checklist of morality, but they're really an invitation to a flourishing life. And it's not just a baseline of decency here, but more, I think, of a rejection of whatever seeks to divide or come between God and ourselves, which then has that power or that thing that blurs our vision to the flourishing life that God pleads for us to choose. And in short, Jesus' words they're not hurdles, but they're more of a doorway to something better, a doorway to wholeness with God our Creator and with our fellow man. Be reconciled with God. We seek and we ask for forgiveness, and God grants it. To be made right with him. He makes us right. And we are made right. And we're grateful to be forgiven. It's just that to be reconciled with God then, it means that I have to then work as hard at being reconciled with others then, with one another. And there are a few things in all of life that compare with the satisfaction and the joy and the connectedness that comes from knowing or being deeply loved, and when we deeply love in authentic, meaningful relationships. And so it is in contrast then too, right? That there are a few things in all of life that hurt as badly and as deeply as the wounds and the sorrow and the alienation that comes from when a relationship is broken. Or whether it is a marriage or another meaningful relationship with another, whether that be with a friend or a family member or whomever. Relationships can be stretched and sometimes become fractured. And then what? I don't think that this is out of the question to state this or to even think this, but I think that every single one of us in this place will have had some kind of an experience with a fractured relationship. And we all know how hard it is to move toward reconciliation, where we either have to admit wrongdoing or to whatever it was that was our part in the fracture. And asking for forgiveness is not always easy, because sometimes it's hard to admit where we're wrong, and even more, there's a whole lot of fear that needs to be overcome to move toward reconciliation. And relationships, they always involve another person, don't they? What if the other person has no interest in reconciling? What if their choice is to remain angry or to remain hateful or resentful? Just to stay at war in some way. There's really nothing at all you can do about that. And sometimes reconciling, it may mean distance. Sometimes it may mean that contact will cease. And not all solutions are ideal. We are on earth, after all, and the world is filled with brokenness. It's filled with broken relationships, but we seek to do whatever we can still. And we work hard not to withhold forgiveness. In fact, when we withhold forgiveness, it probably does more damage to us than it does to anyone else. And if there is bitterness, or if there is resentment within us, anger, grumpiness, acknowledge it. just acknowledge it and turn it over to the Lord. In short, choose life. It isn't enough to just agree with what Jesus teaches. A flourishing life is ours when we actually walk in his ways. So we've got to put our swords down every now and then and really listen. And I know that we're all imperfect people. We've all made our fair share of mistakes. For that, I'm sure of. And when we look back on our lives, there's likely those moments that we will see or that we can recall that each time we think, or where each time we think of them, we wince and just, wished I would have done that one differently. And when we hear Jesus expound on what righteousness is, what right living is, and how it is directly connected to the condition of our hearts, that can almost be a very painful thing, because sometimes I think we're very painfully aware of what is in our heart. And we dare not highbrow over the condition of another person's plight, because we know better there. We know how hard it really is to choose life, the life that God has, and how hard walking in the light of God actually is. But we're also aware of something else too, that the life that Jesus spelled out to the Pharisees is not intended to be, that's not intended to be a crushing description of life or broadening the parameters of certain things. It isn't meant to crush, but I think rather to soak us and saturate us in the love of God, because we have been forgiven. And I think that also is what makes our little place here so special. Church, we are all one of the same. We are sinners saved by grace, where the sweetest words to have spoken in our ear are among these from Paul. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son. And so thank God for grace and mercy, because we have been forgiven. And so then may we walk in humility always, and may we walk side by side as believers in that way too. And there's going to be joy, there's going to be fun, but there will be hard moments too. There always is. But even here, even there, in those moments, thank God for his grace and mercy, because it will drag you through, it will pull you through. And our knees are going to get scraped up here and there. But God loves us. And he's made us right with him through Jesus. So, choose life or death. Yeah, I think that's kind of an easy one, isn't it? We'll choose life. Every time. Choose life. Well, in closing, why don't we sing that song, Amazing Love, and I'll ask if Karen and Darlene